What I believe fueling the interest in ethics and compliance today in higher education has to do with what happened with Sarbanes-Oxley back in 2002. That came about as a result, as we know, as a result of Enron, WorldCom, and then higher education had its own mishaps relative to its governing processes and the question American University, Eckerd College, et cetera, et cetera. And so those combinations have created this question of compliance and how boards are thinking about themselves as governing their universities or colleges. I think the question of ethics, the question of independence relative to board members, the question of conflicts of interest are big questions that are occurring in the higher education world of today. You think of a small college in a small town and its board members made up of folks from the local community, and the question of potential conflicts, particularly if they're business people doing business with the university or the college, and you have to ask how is that being governed, how is that being managed to ensure there's independence relative to the decisions that ultimately that college makes in terms of procurement or other operational issues within the college. Boards have had to come up with new policies, conflict of interest policies, AGB's new policy relative to conflict and independence has been developed over the last year, and certainly will be helpful to boards as they think through the bigger question of conflicts and how their board should be operating relative and to disclosures associated with conflicts. So, public universities have had, and state laws have had certain laws in place: the Sunshine Law, the open meeting laws, the conflict and ethic questions that the states have provided guidance on relative to their university and college boards. So they have probably, in many ways, are ahead of private institutions who've not had to face some of the questions that certainly state laws have now required. In the private institutions, I feel like they have just begun to ask the question of conflict. And of course, the disclosures that are now required on the 990 really have forced those questions in many regards with private institutions. When the 990 form was created, it was really started as a tax requirement through the tax codes. But the 990 came into effect to promote full disclosure of any conflicts relative to boards, accountabilities, descriptions of how the board and the college itself was managing itself relative to any aspect of the operations of the college, including compensation. And so that forced the question of what policies were in place for conflict, what policies were in place for whistleblowing, what policies were in place for compensation practices, what policies were in place for many, many, many things. It's a huge document that requires a lot of work on the part of the institution, but in answering the questions on the 990, forced the college to have to examine its policies and practices. Board members are required to sign off on it. So typically, the 990 is developed through the audit committee or the finance committee, but all board members, presumably have reviewed it. And as I said, it's channeled by the audit committee, but it is a full board requirement. I served on a board where there was a conflict relative to the investment committee. The investment committee typically was made up of individuals who had strong investment backgrounds. Several members came onto the board who had been investing the resources of the college and using their company's processes. And we had to work through, that board had to work through how it would separate that conflict. Ultimately, the one individual that remained on the board, two were on the board, one remained on the board, and they had to divest themselves of any business relationship with the college because of the conflict policy that the board put in place. Generally speaking, I would say that this heightened ethics requirement are positive for the university and for the college. I think it raises the bar in terms of how you have a conversation with a board member as they're coming on as a new board member for what your expectations are about one, their behavior, but also how they would conduct themselves as a member of that board.